The morning my husband tried to steal everything from me didn't start with a fight. It started with the quiet rustle of paper. My financial documents, my property deeds, my company ownership. My inheritance trust all laid out like evidence in a trial I didn't know I was in. He called it a divorce settlement. I called it a declaration of war. If you believe in the power of playing the long game, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. The quiet click of my office door closing was the only sound that followed the end of the call. I leaned back in the rich leather of my chair. A slow, triumphant smile spreading across my face. That single click wasn't just a sound, it was the final, satisfying seal on a $2 million contract I had spent the last 3 grueling months fighting for. My company, Blackwood Consulting Group, had just landed its biggest client to date. A victory that would secure our growth for the next 5 years. The late afternoon sun streamed through the large bay window behind my desk. The kind I'd dreamed of since I was a little girl. It illuminated the dust motes dancing lazily in the air, each one a tiny spark in the golden light of my success. This office, this house, this life, I had built it all. Piece by painstaking piece. The house itself, a beautiful colonial revival in a quiet Boston suburb, was bought with the inheritance from my grandmother. She was a formidable woman who always told me, "Camille, build your fortress first. Build it strong and tall. And only then should you ever consider lowering the drawbridge for anyone." I thought I had followed her advice to the letter. The door opened again, this time without a knock, and my husband Blake strolled in. He stood there for a moment, a slight frown creasing his handsome face as he surveyed the room. For 4 years, that face had been the first thing I saw in the morning and the last thing I saw at night. Lately, however, it had begun to feel less like the face of a partner and more like that of a tenant. "Hey, honey, you'll never guess who I started," the excitement still bubbling in my voice, eager to share this moment with him. He cut me off, not with overt malice, but with the casual, practiced dismissiveness that had become his signature move. "Is the Wi-Fi acting up for you? I'm getting serious lag in the living room. It's impossible to get anything done." He blinked, the words hanging in the air between us. Get anything done? His most strenuous task of the day had been debating online whether a 40mm watch face was too small for his wrist. The triumphant smile on my face faltered, then dissolved completely. "No, Blake. The enterprise-grade fiber-optic internet is working perfectly fine. I just closed the Henderson deal." I said it plainly, hoping the significance would land. "Oh, that's great. Babe. Really great." He said it with all the enthusiasm of someone acknowledging that the mail had arrived. He walked over to the espresso machine in the corner. A sleek, $1,000 Italian appliance I'd bought last Christmas to replace the one he complained was too loud. "This thing is making that weird hissing noise again. And are we out of the Sumatra beans, this stuff?" he said, gesturing to the perfectly good coffee I'd made that morning. "Tastes like dirt." I took a slow, deep breath, the air filling my lungs but doing nothing to quell the familiar, quiet burn of frustration. This was our dynamic, crystallized in a single, 30-second interaction. I was the engine, the architect, the provider. He was the passenger, a very comfortable, very critical passenger who felt entitled to complain about the quality of the ride. As he fiddled with the machine, my mind drifted back. I remembered him in the early days, when my company was just a dream operating out of a cramped office with peeling paint. He was so different then, charming, attentive, full of grand pronouncements about his own ambitions in the art world. He promised he would be my rock, my partner in every sense of the word. We stood under a canopy of white roses on our wedding day, and he'd whispered his vows to me, his eyes sincere and bright. In all things, big and small, he'd said, "We are a team. Your success is my success." How beautifully he'd sold the dream. 4 years later, he was still finding himself. An extended journey of self-discovery that apparently required him to be unburdened by employment, yet fully sponsored by my American Express Black Card. The artist phase had faded, replaced by an angel investor phase where he mostly just took meetings at expensive restaurants and never invested in anything. His success had become my success, just not in the way he had vowed. Later that evening, after the lingering glow of my professional triumph had been thoroughly extinguished by domestic mediocrity, I walked downstairs to start thinking about dinner. I found Blake in my office again. But this time, the atmosphere was utterly transformed. The warm afternoon sun had been replaced by the cool, sterile light of the desk lamp, which cast long, ominous shadows that seemed to claw at the edges of the room. He was standing behind my desk and spread across its polished mahogany surface, like a general plotting a hostile takeover, were my life's documents. Not copies. The originals. The deed to the house, bearing my name and my name alone. The incorporation papers for Blackwood Consulting. The detailed, ironclad legal documents for the CBW Holdings Trust my father, a cautious and brilliant man, had set up for me years before I ever met Blake. Even the title to my father's beloved Vermont cabin was laid out, exposed and vulnerable under the lamplight. He looked up as I entered, and the casual, entitled air from earlier was gone. In its place was a cold, practiced seriousness. It was the face of a stranger. "Camille, we need to talk." "What is all this?" "Blake," I asked, my voice dangerously low. I walked slowly toward the desk, a strange sense of unreality washing over me. My heart wasn't racing with fear, it was beating with a slow, heavy, chilling rhythm. Each beat a hammer blow against my ribs. "This," he said, gesturing to the papers with a theatrical sweep of his hand, "is our life. And a marriage, as you know, is a 50-50 partnership. I think it's time we made our arrangement a little more official, more equitable." He began his speech, the words flowing with a smoothness that told me he had rehearsed them, probably for weeks. He talked about his emotional labor, the unseen support that created the stable home environment necessary for my success. He had the gall to frame himself as a victim, a long-suffering house husband whose contributions weren't quantifiable on a spreadsheet. "You see the numbers, Camille," he said, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "But I see the whole picture. I'm the one who makes sure this house is a home, a sanctuary you can return to. That has value." As he spoke, I watched his hands. He kept picking up my favorite fountain pen from its holder and turning it over and over, his knuckles white. A tiny bead of sweat traced a path down his temple. He wasn't confident. He was terrified. He was a bad actor in a play he'd written himself, and he was desperate for me to believe his performance. The initial shock that had frozen my limbs began to thaw, replaced by an icy, terrifying clarity. The man I had shared my bed with for 1,460 nights was a fraud, and the warmth I once felt for him was rapidly turning into something cold, hard, and sharp. My eyes drifted across the desk again, next to his phone, almost hidden by a stack of my financial statements. was that same business card I'd glimpsed earlier. Thick, cream-colored cardstock. Expensive. Blake's voice sharpened, pulling my attention back with a jolt. He was pointing now. Not at a document, but at the antique silver frame on the credenza. Inside was a black and white photo of my grandmother. Her smile warm and her eyes wise. "And her things," he said, his voice laced with an audacity that felt like a physical blow. "The jewelry. The Wedgwood china. The silver. That's all part of the marital estate. 2. We have to be fair about everything." That was it. That was the line. The final, unforgivable transgression. My gaze flickered to the small silver locket that hung from the corner of the frame. A gift from her on my 16th birthday. I could still feel the weight of it in my palm. Then her voice in my ear. "This is to remind you where you come from. My girl, never forget." To Blake, it was just another asset to be liquidated. To me, it was everything. He wasn't just trying to rob me of my future, he was trying to steal my past. He must have seen the shift in my eyes, because he took a half step back, his performance faltering. But the damage was done. The man I thought I loved had evaporated right before my eyes, replaced by this greedy, calculating usurper. He quickly, clumsily, gathered the papers into a messy pile. "Just think about it, Camille," he stammered, his voice losing its conviction. "We need to be fair to each other." He then turned and practically fled from the room, leaving a profound, ringing silence in his wake. I stood there for a long time. The only sound, the quiet, steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. My mind was a maelstrom of betrayal and white-hot fury. But beneath it all, a cold, hard resolve was beginning to crystallize. He thought this was his move. He thought he held all the cards. My gaze fell back on the business card he'd forgotten in his haste. I walked over to the desk, my movements steady and deliberate, my hands no longer trembling. I picked it up. The name was printed in elegant, raised letters, Stephen Finch, legal consultant. The name clicked into place, triggering a memory from a networking dinner months ago, a story from a colleague about a real estate lawyer who had been disbarred for forging documents and now operated in the murky gray areas of the law. A consultant for people with more ambition than ethics. I held the card between my fingers, the thick paper feeling heavy with the weight of this calculated betrayal. Blake hadn't just woken up this morning with a bad idea. This was a premeditated attack. He thought he was smart. He thought he had found the perfect weapon to dismantle my life. A small, humorless smile touched my lips for the first time that night. He had chosen his lawyer poorly, and he had, most fatally, underestimated his wife. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of his. I didn't sleep that night. After Blake had scurried away, leaving the scent of his cheap cologne and betrayal lingering in the air, I remained in my office. The business card for Stephen Finch felt cold and sharp-edged in my hand. It was a tangible piece of the conspiracy, a solid object in a world that had suddenly turned to smoke and mirrors. I didn't cry. The shock was too deep, the anger too cold for tears. Instead, I sat at my desk and I worked. I pulled up the original files for the CBW Holdings Trust. I read through every line my father's lawyers had written, every clause designed to protect me. I reread my grandmother's will. I armed myself with knowledge, reinforcing the walls of my fortress, just as she had taught me. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept through the window, I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a strategist. At precisely 8 o'clock the next morning, my phone was in my hand. I didn't hesitate. The first and only call I made was to Rebecca Vance, my corporate lawyer and, thankfully, a woman who despised emotional fluff as much as I did. "Rebecca," I said, my voice even and clear. "It's Camille. We have a situation." I laid it all out for her, stripping the story of emotion and presenting only the facts: Blake's speech, the documents on my desk, his claims on my inheritance and my company, and finally, the name Stephen Finch. Rebecca was silent for a moment on the other end of the line, and I could practically hear the gears turning in her brilliant legal mind. She didn't offer condolences or gasp in shock. She offered a weapon. "The CBW Holdings Trust," she said, her voice sharp and decisive. "Was it established before your marriage?" "Years before," I confirmed, "and the house was purchased exclusively with funds from that trust." "Then he has nothing," she said, and for the first time, I allowed myself to feel a flicker of relief. "He can demand the moon, Camille. It doesn't mean he's going to get it. Marital property laws don't apply to pre-existing, protected trusts. He's being fed bad advice by a disgraced ambulance chaser. Finch probably took his money, knowing this was a losing battle from the start." She paused. "So, don't get angry. Don't get emotional. Let's get strategic. Let's make sure he not only gets nothing, but he never sees it coming." Her words were like a splash of ice water, washing away any remaining vestiges of sentimentality. She was right. This wasn't a broken marriage anymore. It was a hostile takeover attempt, and I was going to treat it as such. My next call was to Emma, my fiercely loyal and preternaturally observant executive assistant. "Emma," I said, keeping my tone professional, "I need a favor. And it's off the books. Can you pull the detailed statements for all joint accounts and credit cards for the last 6 months? I want you to flag anything unusual. Any large payments. Any consulting fees. Anything that looks even slightly out of place." "On it, Camille," she said. "New questions asked." That was Emma. She had the discretion of a Swiss banker and the efficiency of a Navy SEAL. Less than an hour later, an encrypted file landed in my inbox. I opened it, and there it was. On a statement from 3 months prior, a single charge for $2,500 made out to Finch Legal Consulting. Beneath it were smaller, recurring charges to a real estate appraisal service I'd never heard of. He hadn't just thought about this. He had been investing in his betrayal for months, using our joint account, which, in reality, was funded 100% by my income. The audacity of it was breathtaking. He was using my own money to plot how to steal the rest of it. The day grew heavier. The familiar comfort of my home now felt alien. Each room a potential crime scene of memories he was trying to loot. My phone rang again in the early afternoon. It was my mom. Her voice tight, with a poorly concealed anxiety. "Honey, I just had the strangest call from Blake," she began. "He was asking all sorts of questions. So casual. You know how he can be. He was asking about the old cabin in Vermont, wondering if the deed was complicated. And then he asked if grandmother's jewelry was properly insured. He said he was just worried about protecting our family's legacy." My blood ran cold. Our family's legacy. He was already claiming it as his own. He wasn't just targeting me. He was mapping out the entire Blackwood family tree, looking for assets to plunder. The scope of his greed was far larger than I had imagined. "Thanks for telling me, Mom," I said, my voice steady despite the rage coiling in my stomach. "Don't worry about it. I'll handle it." That evening, I had another video conference with Rebecca. I told her about the payment Emma found and the call from my mother. "He's making our case for us," Rebecca said, a grim smile on her face. "This is premeditated. Now, here's how we're going to play this. He's arrogant. He underestimates you. We're going to use that. I'm drafting a simple document. A one-page acknowledgement of separate property. It will list the house, the company, and key inherited assets, and state clearly that they are your sole property, held by the trust. It will look like a meaningless piece of legal housekeeping." "And you think he'll sign it?" I asked. "I think his ego won't let him refuse," she replied. "You'll present it to him not as a demand, but as a concession. Tell him you'll consider his ridiculous terms. But for your own peace of mind, you just need this one little thing signed to feel secure. Frame it as you being emotional and needing reassurance. His vanity will do the rest. He'll see it as the signature of a defeated woman and won't think twice." The plan was brilliant. It was diabolical. It was perfect. The next day, I put the next phase into motion, knowing he was likely in the house. I waited until he was in the living room, supposedly working on his laptop. I started my phone's voice recorder and slipped it into my pocket before walking in. I feigned confusion and sadness. "Blake, I've been thinking about what you said." I started, my voice soft. It's a lot to take in. This big legal battle. I don't want that. Isn't there a way we can just figure this out? You talk about a new life, a fresh start. He took the bait immediately, his condescending persona snapping back into place. "See, I knew you'd be reasonable," he said, closing his laptop. "Look, Camille, it's not personal. It's business. You're a great businesswoman, you should understand. I've invested 4 years of my life into this partnership. I deserve a return on that investment. It's only fair that I get to live the life that you have become accustomed to." He said it without a trace of irony or shame. He had just admitted, on tape, that he saw our marriage as a financial investment from which he was now cashing out. That recording was now Exhibit B. That night, after he had gone to bed, I walked through the quiet, darkened house. I paused in the dining room and ran my hand over the smooth, cool surface of my grandmother's Wedgwood china, displayed in its glass front cabinet. Each plate, each cup, was a memory. Family dinners, holiday celebrations, moments of joy and sorrow shared around a table. Blake saw it as an asset, a line item on a ledger. I saw my family's history. In that quiet moment, I wasn't mourning my marriage anymore. There was nothing left to mourn. I was simply preparing for the battle to defend my home. A quiet, cold determination settled deep in my bones. The final act of the prelude came the following evening. I came home from a late meeting to find Blake sitting at the dining room table. He had taken out my grandmother's priceless china, the delicate plates and bowls I reserved for the most special occasions, and he was using them to eat greasy takeout pizza. A bottle of cheap beer leaving a condensation ring on the polished mahogany table. He looked up at me, a smug, self-satisfied smile on his face. This wasn't just disrespect, it was a power play. A deliberate desecration. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin before pushing a thick stack of papers across the table towards me. I had Stephen finalize the paperwork, he announced, his voice oozing with a false sense of finality. This is the final settlement offer. Everything we discussed. It's more than fair. He leaned forward, his eyes cold and hard. Sign it, Camille. Or walk away from this house, this company, and this life with nothing but the clothes on your back. I stared at the stack of papers he had pushed towards me. The top page was titled in bold, "Impersonal Letters, Marital Settlement Agreement." Beneath the grease stain from his pizza slice, I could see clauses that signed away my company, my home, my family's heirlooms, my entire life. Section by meticulous section. The air in the dining room grew thick and heavy, charged with the finality of his ultimatum. He leaned back in his chair, the very picture of smug satisfaction, watching me, waiting for me to shatter. He expected tears. He expected pleading. He expected a dramatic, messy collapse. What he didn't expect was the cold, quiet calm that was settling over me like a shroud of ice. I let out a shaky breath. A calculated performance of a woman on the edge. I made my hand tremble slightly as I reached for the documents. My fingers brushed against the cheap, thin copy paper. A stark contrast to the weighty, high-quality stock my own lawyers used. It felt flimsy, fraudulent, just like the man sitting across from me. I read through the first page, my eyes scanning the dense legal text while my mind raced, replaying every step of Rebecca's plan. I could feel his gaze on me, enjoying my feigned distress, savoring what he believed was his ultimate victory. Blake. I started, letting my voice crack just enough. I looked up at him, my eyes wide and glistening with unshed tears I had summoned from a deep well of remembered pain, not pain from him, but from every disappointment I had ever overcome. This is everything. You're asking for everything. I'm asking for what's fair, he said, his voice smooth and patronizing. I'm asking for my half. I dropped my gaze back to the papers, shaking my head as if in disbelief. This was the moment. The entire plan hinged on this performance. Okay, I whispered, the word barely audible. Okay, I'll sign. A triumphant glint flashed in his eyes. He started to lean forward, reaching for a pen, but I held up a hand. But I have one condition, I said, my voice small and fragile. It's probably silly. It's just for me. For my own peace of mind. He frowned, instantly suspicious. What condition? I pulled a single sheet of paper from my handbag, which I had placed on the chair beside me. It was Rebecca's document, the acknowledgement of separate property. It looked simple, official, and to an arrogant fool utterly unimportant. Before I sign this, I said, gesturing to his agreement, I need you to sign this. It just confirms that the house and the company were mine before we got married. I know it won't matter after I sign your papers, but I just need to see it in writing. Just for a moment, so I can feel like I'm not being completely erased. I looked at him, letting a single, perfect tear trace a path down my cheek. Please, Blake, for the 4 years we had. I watched him process it. I could see the war in his head, his greed battling his suspicion. But his ego was always his most powerful general. He saw a broken, emotional woman making one last, pathetic request to soothe her wounded pride. He saw it as a meaningless concession that would get him a multi-million-dollar payday. His suspicion faded, replaced by an indulgent, condescending smile. Of course, honey, he said, his voice dripping with false magnanimity. He snatched the paper from my hand, barely glancing at the text. He saw the words Blackwood Holdings and separate property and scoffed internally. Assuming his document would override this one in a matter of minutes, he picked up his own expensive fountain pen, a gift from me, naturally, and signed his name with a confident, ostentatious flourish at the bottom of the page. "There," he said, sliding the paper back to me. "It's done. I'm glad we could be amicable about this." My heart was hammering against my ribs, a wild drumbeat of adrenaline and icy triumph. I took the document, my masterpiece of legal entrapment, and carefully placed it back in my handbag. Then, I picked up his pen. With a steady hand, I signed my name on the signature line of his worthless, fraudulent settlement agreement. I pushed his papers back toward him. "It's done," I echoed. Then, I stood up. In one slow, deliberate movement, I twisted the diamond wedding ring from my finger. It was a 3-carat stone he had insisted on, purchased with a loan from my company that he had never repaid. I didn't throw it. I didn't make a scene. I placed it gently on the table, next to the greasy pizza crusts on my grandmother's china. Then, I took the house keys from my pocket and set them down beside the ring. The soft clink of metal on wood was the loudest sound in the room. "Goodbye, Blake," I said, my voice devoid of all emotion. I turned and walked away. I didn't run. I walked with the steady, unhurried pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going. I didn't look back. I walked out the front door, closing it softly behind me, and got into my car. The moment the door was shut, sealing me in my own quiet space, I pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking now. Not from fear, but from the sheer, vibrating intensity of the moment. I dialed Rebecca. She answered on the first ring. "He signed," I said, my voice a low, steady hum. "Begin." The next morning, as I sat in a comfortable suite at the Four Seasons, I imagined Blake waking up. He would stretch in my bed, look out at my garden, and feel like the king of a castle he had just conquered. I knew his morning routine. He would make himself a coffee with the expensive machine, then sit down with his phone to broadcast his victory to the world. I checked Instagram on a dummy account. Sure enough, there it was, a picture of his feet propped up on my mahogany desk, a glass of my best single malt scotch in his hand from the night before. The caption read, "New chapter. Big things coming. Number blessed. Number entrepreneur." The first domino fell at 9:15 a.m. I imagined him strolling into his favorite artisanal coffee shop, ordering his usual complicated latte, and breezily tapping his credit card. Declined. He would laugh it off, blaming the machine. He'd try another card from our joint account. Declined. The color would drain from his face. He would step outside, fuming, and call the bank, only to be met by a polite but firm customer service agent telling him the account had been frozen by the primary account holder's legal representative. The second domino fell an hour later. As he was probably still trying to figure out the bank situation, an email would have landed in his inbox. It would be from the dealership that leased his top-of-the-line BMW 7 Series, a lease that was, of course, in my company's name. The email would be brief and coldly corporate, informing him that due to a termination of his authorized use, the vehicle would be remotely disabled and repossessed within 24 hours. The third, and perhaps most satisfying, domino fell when he got back to the house. I had called my smart home security provider the moment I left the night before. His biometrics, his passcodes, his very digital existence within the house's ecosystem had been erased. I pictured him trying to adjust the thermostat, only to be met with an access denied message. He'd try to turn on the lights in the living room, but the system would not recognize his voice command. He was being digitally exorcised from the premises. He was no longer the master of the castle. He was a ghost, unable to interact with the world around him. Just as I was savoring that image, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Emma. "You are not going to believe this. Check your secure email." I opened the email. It contained a screenshot from a private Instagram account belonging to a woman I'd never seen before. Her name was Isabella Croft. In the photo, she was laughing, clinking a champagne glass with someone just out of frame. And on her wrist, sparkling under the restaurant lights, was my grandmother's diamond tennis bracelet, a piece I had reported as lost 6 months ago. A piece Blake had helped me frantically search, his face a mask of loving concern. My rage, which had cooled into a strategic "Itzi resolve," flared hot again. This wasn't just about greed. It was about a profound, layered betrayal that sickened me to my core. While he was comforting me about my lost heirloom, he had already given it to his mistress. Fueled by this new fire, I made another call, this time to my next-door neighbor, a sweet, retired man named Mr. Leap Henderson, who had a fondness for home security gadgets. I asked him if, by any chance, his front-facing camera might have captured any unusual activity at my house over the past few days. 15 minutes later, he sent me a video file. The timestamp was from 3 days prior. The footage was crystal clear: Blake and Isabella, laughing together, carrying my silver tea service and 2 boxes of my father's rare first edition books out of my house and loading them into her car. It was all there. Undeniable proof of grand theft. My phone rang again. It was Rebecca. "Heads up," she said. I just got off the phone with a very loud, very angry Stephen Finch. He was screaming about fraud and coercion. "What did you say?" I asked. I calmly informed him. Rebecca said, her voice laced with amusement, that we had a signed, notarized document acknowledging my client's sole ownership of all disputed properties. I also mentioned we had video evidence of his client and an associate removing items from the home, and that if he wanted to use the word fraud, I would be happy to discuss it with the district attorney's office. The line went very quiet after that. The final phase was in motion. Blake was trapped. His money was gone. His car was being taken. His lawyer had abandoned him. He was a prisoner in a house that no longer recognized him. And then, right on schedule, the doorbell rang. I wasn't there to see it, but Rebecca had arranged for a process server to be escorted by 2 local police officers to keep the peace. I imagined Blake, flustered and panicked, swinging the door open, probably expecting a delivery or perhaps even his lawyer coming to the rescue. Instead, he would see 2 uniformed officers standing impassively on his doorstep. Blake Carter, one of them, would ask. "Yes, what is this?" he'd bluster. "This is my house." The process server would step forward and hand him a thick envelope. "You're being served," he'd say. Blake would tear it open. Inside, he would find an emergency eviction notice, giving him 24 hours to vacate the property. "This is insane. You can't evict me from my own home," he would scream, his face turning a blotchy red. And then, the officer would calmly point to the second document attached to the notice, a crisp, clean copy of the acknowledgement of separate property he had so arrogantly signed the night before. His own signature would be highlighted in yellow, a stark testament to his fatal mistake. "No, sire," the officer would say, his voice flat and unemotional. "According to this document, which you signed right here. This was never your house at all. The silence on the other end of the line after Rebecca told me the eviction notice had been served was profound. I sat in my hotel suite, the city lights twinkling below. But I wasn't seeing them. I was picturing Blake's face, the blotchy red of his fury curdling into the pale, sickly white of dawning horror as he stared at his own signature. I didn't have to wait long. My phone buzzed, and his name flashed across the screen. I let it ring twice. A small, cruel indulgence. Before answering and putting it on speaker. "Camille, what the hell is this?" he roared, his voice a raw torrent of panic and rage. "There are cops at my door. They're trying to kick me out of my own house. You have to call them off." I remained silent, letting him burn himself out. "Did you hear me?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "This is insane. You can't do this. We had an agreement. I have a signed document." "So do I." "Blake," I said, my voice as calm and cool as the glass of water on the table beside me. The statement hit him like a physical blow. There was a moment of sputtering, of frantic, incoherent noise. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the frantic scrambling of a cornered animal. "What? What are you talking about? That little paper, that was nothing. It was for you, to make you feel better. It was a legally binding acknowledgement of separate property," I stated, reciting the words from memory. "A document in which you affirmed, with your own signature, that you have absolutely no legal claim to the house or any of its associated assets. You signed it freely. It's over." His breathing became ragged. "Adesperate." Wheezing sound. The rage was completely gone now, replaced by a new line ninders. More pathetic emotion pleading. "Camille, please," he whimpered, and the sound made my stomach turn. "Honey, please, don't do this. It was a mistake. I was stupid. I listened to that idiot lawyer. We can fix this. I'll rip up the agreement. We can go back to how things were. Please. I love you. I love you." The words, once the foundation of my world, now sounded like a foreign language I no longer understood. They were just sounds, empty of meaning. A last-ditch tool he was trying to use to get what he wanted. "You signed what you wanted, Blake," I said, my voice cutting through his pathetic groveling with the finality of a guillotine. "You laid out your terms. You told me to sign or leave. I signed. Now you get to live with it." I pressed the end call button before he could respond, cutting off the sound of his pathetic sobs. I stared at the blank screen of my phone. There was no triumph, no elation. Just a vast, quiet, and profound emptiness. The war was over. I had won. The next afternoon, I drove back to my street. I didn't pull into the driveway. I parked a few houses down, under the shade of an old oak tree, and I watched. The spectacle was even more pathetic than I had imagined. There was no moving truck, just a beat-up, rusted minivan that looked like it had been borrowed from a reluctant friend. Blake was hauling things out of the house himself, not valuable antiques or expensive electronics, but boxes filled with the detritus of his failed life. I saw his ridiculous, oversized gaming chair, the one that clashed horribly with my living room decor. I saw stacks of self-help books with titles like The Alpha Mindset and Manifest Your Millions. I saw boxes of designer clothes I had paid for, now looking sad and wrinkled. His BMW was gone. As promised, Isabella, the recipient of my grandmother's diamonds, was nowhere in sight. He was utterly, completely alone. He moved slowly. His shoulders slumped in defeat. A man hollowed out by his own greed. He looked smaller, weaker, stripped of the arrogance that had been his armor for so long. As he hauled another box toward the minivan, he looked up, and his eyes met mine through the windshield of my car. He froze. A box of protein powder and video games clutched in his hands. His face, already pale, seemed to collapse. It was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock, followed by a wave of shame so profound it was almost painful to watch. He didn't look angry. He didn't look defiant. He just looked broken. He quickly dropped his gaze, turned, and practically threw the box into the back of the van. Unable to hold my stare. In that moment, I felt nothing. No pity. No anger. No satisfaction. Just a quiet finality. He was a ghost from a past life. And I was just watching him fade away. I waited until the rattling minivan had turned the corner and disappeared from view. I waited another 10 minutes. Just letting the silence settle. Then, I put the car in drive, pulled into my own driveway, and turned off the engine. I walked up the path and used my own key to open my own front door. The moment I stepped inside, the change was palpable. The air felt lighter. The sunlight streaming through the windows seemed brighter. The house was quiet. But it was a peaceful, clean quiet. Not the tense, heavy silence that had suffocated me for months. I took a deep, cleansing breath, and it felt like the first real breath I had taken in years. It was the breath of freedom. The smell of his cologne was gone. The weight of his presence was gone. It was just my house again. My fortress. My sanctuary. 6 months later, the house was filled with noise again. But this time it was the warm, joyful sound of laughter and conversation. I was hosting a small dinner party for my closest friends. The people who had been my true support system. The dining room, once the scene of my final confrontation with Blake, was now glowing, lit by candles and filled with the aroma of the meal I had happily cooked myself. My grandmother's Wedgwood china was on the table, holding food shared in celebration, its honor restored. Rebecca was there, looking elegant as always, a glass of champagne in her hand. We found a quiet moment by the window overlooking the garden. "You seem happy, Camille," she said, her usually serious face softened by a genuine smile. "I am," I said, and I was surprised by how true it was. "I'm at peace." "Well," she said with a satisfied sip, "a little justice helps with that. By the way, Isabella Croft's lawyer contacted me last week. She returned every last piece of jewelry to avoid a grand larceny charge. It's all sitting in a bank vault for you." I felt a wave of relief. My grandmother's legacy was safe. And Blake, she continued, he finally responded to our civil suit for the items he sold. He can't afford a lawyer, so he's representing himself. Badly. We'll get a default judgment. But honestly, it'll be like getting blood from a stone. From what I hear, he's living in a tiny studio apartment across town and working some dead-end telemarketing job. He lost everything. I nodded, feeling a distant, detached sadness for the man he could have been, but none for the man he had become. His fate was a prison of his own making. My gaze drifted toward the back of the house. The garage, which had once housed his ridiculously expensive car, had been my project for the last few months. I had it completely transformed. The concrete floor was now covered in warm hardwood. The walls lined with custom-built cherrywood shelves. It was no longer a garage. It was a library. My library. After my guests had left, I walked into the new room. My father's collection of rare first edition books now sat proudly on the shelves, safe and cherished. On one wall, I had hung the business awards and accolades I had earned over the years, no longer hidden away in my office, but displayed for me to see. This room was a testament to my past and my future. It was a space I had reclaimed, a space I had filled with the things that truly mattered: my family's legacy and my own accomplishments. I ran my hand along the spines of my father's books, the worn leather cool beneath my fingertips. I realized my victory wasn't in Blake's spectacular failure. It wasn't about revenge. It was about this quiet, steadfast peace. It was about standing in a room built on truth and integrity, surrounded by the love of generations and the fruits of my own hard work. I pulled out a worn copy of my father's favorite book, its pages soft with age. I sat down in the comfortable leather armchair in the center of the room, the same chair that had once sat in my office. I opened the book, and a small, genuine smile touched my lips. I hadn't just won a battle. I had won my life back. And in the quiet, peaceful sanctuary I had built for myself, I was finally, truly home.